Everybody, we're going to get started because it's 9:30 and we've only got an hour with Wellington Electricity this morning. So kia ora, Greg, thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to pass it over to Brad to do a bit of an introduction.
Thank you, Councillor Paul. Kia ora, councillors. Today we have a briefing from Wellington Electricity. The electricity system in New Zealand is supported by quite a few different organizations that isn't as vertically integrated as other countries. So there's generation that happens through companies like Genesis and Meridian, largely renewable, a national transmission provider, which is Transpower, and then broadly within regions, there's distribution companies, lines companies, of which Wellington Electricity is our lines company that distributes power from the transmission system through to people's homes, and that's how our community gets this essential commodity. Today we have the privilege, or I have the privilege of introducing Mr. Greg Skelton, who's the CEO of Wellington Electricity, here to provide you with a briefing, and also my ex-boss.
Okay, kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Greg Skelton from Wellington Electricity, and thanks, Brad, for your wonderful introduction. I was wondering when you're going to stop your introduction, and you could almost have my whole presentation for me, so great, and lovely to see you doing well at Council. And I have shared with Brad that we are lending him to Council, and once he's got that out of his system, he can come back and do some more electricity work. So, yeah, that's right, that's right. Great, that's good. I've never been told that I can't be heard, so that's wonderful. I was to be joined by some colleagues today, but looking at the parking in the city, I think they're probably finding their way to the room, so please excuse their lateness as they attend. So why don't I make a start, and firstly just start with our thoughts with the loss of life at Loafers Lodge. We thought that was a terrible incident and a tragedy, and something that doesn't often happen in Wellington, thank goodness. So just to thank the council for the work they've done with that and how they managed that, we thought that was very good. From an electricity point of view, Wellington Electricity, as Bradley's outlined, does sort of provide the connection to the customers in the region and extending through to the other cities to the north and west. And so what I thought we'd do today is just give a bit of a feeling or a bit of a flavour of what's been happening in the electricity sector, with probably a fairly forward view about what's going to be happening, especially around decarbonisation. Decarbonisation, largely through the Climate Change Commission, has signals pretty strongly they'd like electrification to try and deal with most of the fossil fuel issues that we're trying to do to get to carbon zero by 2050. So why don't I just start by outlining some of the areas that I'll present today, largely in line with what Siobhan Proctor suggested I should touch on. And we'll have some questions, time for questions at the end. So our network area is reasonably large as a footprint, but we do run a very compact CBD. Is that my speaking time, eh?
Right. I've heard enough, no.
That's right, yeah. Oh, 2 slides in, that's probably okay. Are there any questions? So we're largely a poles and wires infrastructure company. I'm getting a bit of feedback. Let me try and turn that off. Beautiful. Thank you. So we're a poles and wires company. We're about 4,500 kilometres of network. About 64% of that's underground, which is fantastic for the weather that Wellington provides us. Not so good for earthquakes. We supply about 400,000 people through about 173,000 connections. So that puts us around number 4 in New Zealand from size and scale. We are price quality regulated through the Commerce Commission, so largely our price is set by how the Commission allows us to vary the price, and our amount of time our network's unavailable or interrupted is also measured by the Commission pretty stringently through international measures. We produce a 10-year asset management plan, and that's on our website. It's about 401 pages for our last one, largely with some of the challenges we've got going forward. And we do a lot of investment and replacement of assets to maintain a safe, reliable, affordable electricity distribution system. Our shareholders are based in Hong Kong. They have similar infrastructure investments in Australia, UK, Hong Kong, and Canada. And they provide an international expertise and a lot of shared learnings for what we bring back into Wellington. We also have a strong ports group globally through Hutchinson. And we also own in New Zealand Enviro NZ and also Dominion Salt, which is our life sciences group back in Hong Kong. Other interests are in health and property and in education. If we look at the network itself, it does perform very well for its customers. It's a very reliable network. If you look at that slide, you can sort of see that on this vertical axis, it's the duration of time that the network's interrupted. It's very low. And also the price of what the network costs the customers is also very low. And that's largely due to the fairly dense population of the Wellington footprint that we operate across. And we're roughly got about 35 customers per kilometre of assets employed, which is quite a high number. Customers will expect to be off supply for about 35 minutes once every 2 years. So that's an average. People have had a power supply interruption. They've probably been off for 4 or 5 hours. But hopefully they don't get too many of those. There are areas that do get their fair share of outages, and we tend to work on those as priority areas, which we do reinvest into. So there's a few areas that we're looking at the moment, not too many, thankfully. ICP is a term we use, another 3-letter acronym, which we're full of, and that's the installation connection point. So that's a point where the network connects to a customer's service cable, and that becomes the customer's lookout to make sure that's maintained. Beyond that service cable is a metering point, and that metering point is where the energy that gets consumed is reconciled, and that's usually provided by a retailer. We can see a lot of our overhead network, but what we can't see is our underground LV network. So largely, the large yellow square, the zone substation we can see, but we can't see distribution transformers. And we can't actually see the customer ICPs, which are on the network. I'm feeling a lot more confident now because my cavalry has arrived. So let me introduce Kevin, who's our General Manager of our Project Management Office, Waka, who's our General Manager of Asset Management, and Pema, who's one of our planning engineers in the Wellington area. For the last 5 years, seen quite a large upswing in subdivision growth in Wellington, which we've been very happy to provide network assets to. Traditionally, Wellington's been quite a low growth network. There hasn't been a lot of growth on the network, and that's allowed us to manage our assets prudently to allow them to actually carry on with a pretty good life, a pretty mature asset base, and allow to fill up the headroom capacity. That's all about to change as decarbonisation is starting to drive greater and greater electrification. One of the key things we need to look out for is health and safety of people working in and around our assets and sustainable workforce. This is a clip of a video that's come from the UK when we purchased the London network. We saw that the practices on that network were probably not world leading. So what was happening on that network allowed the new management coming into that business to actually start to think carefully about how they get the message across around health and safety. These sorts of things do show people the consequences of actually not isolating and earthing their works before they work on them, and therefore it's a very good reminder for our workforce to make sure that they are aware of the critical risks around electricity. So we continually support a safety culture, and it aligns staff work processes with activities with critical risk controls. So it's really around awareness of people who are working and make sure they've got the skills and training and capability. And the bottom line of this is that you're at your most vulnerable when you feel the safest. So there's one of those old proverbs that we tend to trot out occasionally, which is great. When we look at how the industry is connected, and Brad touched on this in his opening introductions, we sort of sit in the middle between our big brother or sister company, Transpower, who's the national grid operator. They have generation coming into their system, and then we connect as a distribution system. And then we've got retailers who handle the billing, the metering, that connect to the customers. So it's largely a kind of a left to right process, and it's kind of fairly linear. That's all about to change, because what's happening is all the cool stuff's going to happen with the customers. There will be people, some around this table, who are connecting solar panels or battery systems or buying electric vehicles. And that's going to be quite a strong part of our future. that changes the dynamic because the generation shifts from the left of the picture to the right of the picture. The energy, the value of energy generated at home or the avoidance of actually using the grid was also rewarded by customers doing those actions in the future. So it's a very different model that we're moving towards. If you look at the rules that we've got now with the price quality regulation through the Commerce Commission and the slightly wider rules, which is market regulation from the Electricity Authority, we start to see that there's going to be a bit of a gap unless we start bringing customers into some of the answers on how we run our network in the future. So a lot of this is around setting up a greater collaboration with customers and industry as to how we need to run this in the future and really get their cooperation. And by doing that, it does allow us to start to shift the customer to the top of the stack of energy, and also allows us to think about the value and hierarchy of that stack. We'll talk a wee bit more about that later on. One of the things that we've been really fascinated about is what's happening in the transport sector. It's been quite remarkable that we've been working with KiwiRails about the new ferries for the last 2 or 3 years. Many of the people around the table have probably heard me speak before about trolley buses and the combined public transport work that we've done, and largely allowing that to shift into what's been really new technology rather than stay with poles and wires for another 50 years of asset life. So that's been very successful in Wellington. I think Wellington and the council should be commended for moving across to battery buses. We think that's a wonderful thing for the city. What we hadn't considered was battery aircraft, and that's something that we're still getting a head around. Bat Sounds there at Wellington Airport are actually starting to do that, and we also have Robinson Industries and the Lower Hutt also helping internationally with battery hybrid planes as well. So it's wonderful to see how those things are actually going to develop. Those loads I've just had up on the screen are very large loads though. They're into sort of the megawatts, where our homes will probably do 2 or 3 kilowatts. These things are now 1,000 times bigger at sort of 10 megawatts. One of the other companies we're working with pretty closely is KiwiRail, and they're looking at larger, faster, more frequent trains on the rail system. Wellington's very, very lucky having an electrified transport system with trains and bringing people into the CBD and bringing people out. And you think of the numbers of 80,000 daily commuters and 40 million trips a year, that's a very big piece of infrastructure that's already electrified, but they want to go larger. And going larger for us is going to put significant load on the network, and it's going to start to build into us having to provide more capacity in our upper network assets. What I mean by that is the very large power transformers, of which there's 27 sites on our network, and the very large sub-transmission cables, which are up around 33,000 volts, again, supplying those 27 sites. So it's exciting for us. It is a big investment. It's about $60 million. And we have to go back to the Commerce Commission and ask for funding for some of this work. So that's really sort of sitting in a big change we're about to hear in the next 2 weeks about how our input methodologies on what we're allowed to spend our CapEx and OpEx on are going to be funded going forward. So that's something we're looking at with bated breath. Interestingly enough, though, their system, like ours, does need maintenance, has to be shut down, but luckily it does have an alternative. You can catch a bus. So the whole idea about running an infrastructure or a service, having to maintain it, but having an alternative supply is really important to us. And in most cases, for us, it's the gas network. The gas network in Wellington does a lot of heavy lifting. 1 in 3 homes has a gas supply. 55,000 customers have a gas connection. We are waiting for a report from government as to what the future of gas is going to be on our network, because that gas supply, if it goes to full electrification, is an additional load on our network we have to manage. And that's going to create another very large investment portfolio and thinking of my 3 friends who have just arrived. And they're probably thinking about that. That's why they've probably just been a wee bit late getting to this meeting. If we start to put together the expected growth and how it's materialising on the network, you can sort of see there's large pockets of growth which tend to have megawatt rather than kilowatt numbers or letters following the number in front of them. So we've got some very, very large point loads, whether it's the airport, and they're going to an energy centre. We've got Moa Point as well. We've got Weta Digital all out on the peninsula, which we're working with at the moment. But you've also got the bus transport and the bus charging stations, which are getting into anywhere between 2 and 6 megawatts. And we've also got electric ferries with KiwiRail, which again are needing 10 megawatts, very large batteries coming onto those ferries. And we've got the train system we talked about. So we've got a lot of very big public transport coming in, which is really going to start to bring a lot of investment back into that infrastructure. And that's, for us, extremely useful and extremely beneficial for consumers at the time when the assets are getting to the age of needing replacement. So we're quite lucky we haven't replaced the assets early. We've been able to manage those into a very mature life. And now when we've got the time to change them, we can actually change them for the electrification projects which are now coming to us and get the right capacity. We don't want to change them out twice or three times. It's a waste of money for our customers. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that electric vehicles are becoming increasingly popular. Their popularity is only now limited by the supply from ships bringing them into the country. So with government subsidies of between $8,000 and $9,000, these vehicles are starting to get attractive for, let's say, the more wealthy part of our community. And that's something that we're tracking quite well. At the moment, electric vehicles have a government subsidy, but they really have no support for us on how we're going to charge them on the network. We're completely blind as to where they turn up, which driveway they park in, how they're going to charge, when they're going to charge. So a lot of this stuff is going to start to force us into having engagements with the public and the community, or with policymakers to make that more visible to the lines company that's expected to build the infrastructure to charge these vehicles. Otherwise, the lights go out. And that's quite embarrassing for a lines company when the government's saying you're calling off the engagement of going to electrified transport fleet. So we're sort of at the bottom of that chain. We need to actually get to the top of it and start getting some plans and things in place. Here's a heat map of where the electric vehicles are going. You could see the brighter colours. The orange is a lot of vehicles coming into Wellington City, which is fantastic. And you can see the vehicles are also being distributed up the valley. We thought... no, this is just where Waka Kotahi has told us that the vehicle has appeared in a street. We don't know the street number. It's as much information as they can give us at the moment. It's interesting, though, when you look at the deprivation map of the Wellington region, you can start to see that the people who aren't buying vehicles are the ones who are in the highest deprivation area. So we do need to think a way through of how to make electrified transport available to those communities. And there's some ideas around that we're thinking with. It may be like a MEVO scheme where we start to bring in the Nissan Leafs as they get into their 10th year, and we start to repower those and make that as an open public transport for those people geo-fenced into the area of Wellington. Constraints. Constraints on networks are real when the load grows very, very quickly from step changes. So this picture on the left now kind of shows where most of our substations are and the capacity status. Substations being upgraded right at the minute, apart from Evans Bay, which we currently have live, are showing that we're in a pretty good space. If you roll forward 10 years and put on the load that we're expecting with no reinforcement, we start getting into some pretty big investment problems where we are going to be short of capacity in those areas. So it's pretty widespread, largely because of the previous slides on where the load is actually going to move to. So that's created quite a lot of planning for us. What we did in the last 2 years is we went away from 10-year planning, and we challenged the people at this end of the table to actually look out 30 years. Look at replacing all of our assets, which in 30 years all get replaced because of their ageing condition, and then add on the government's climate change initiatives, and let's see where that goes for our planning going forward. So as part of that, we also have to start to engage with our customers in a slightly different manner. We have to become almost energy agnostic. We almost have to become a trusted advisor on putting up into our public website ideas around what could actually serve them the best of getting the cheapest energy into their homes. So it's a sort of different view for a lines company on the basis that we don't set the price for energy. What we can do is set when energy gets used to show consumers what is the cheapest option for them to actually operate their homes or their businesses. So it's something we're working on to try and engage with that, and you'll start to see Wellington Electricity turn up at Better Home and Living shows or green shows or that, just to engage with consumers about where we're going with energy. One of the ways we're doing this is just through very simple animation, because some of the things around electricity are very complex, and we don't want to start putting numbers or graphs in front of the public. happy to do it with councillors. So I'll play this through animation, which kind of gets some of the ideas around demand response and how some of these things need to actually be considered. And there's no sound. Is that because my... Sorry? No sound? Okay. Well, I could play it and I'll sing across it. How's that sound? So largely it talks about Wellington Electricity as a lines company looking after poles and wires in the community. And obviously there's plenty of options for where consumers are going to be buying electric vehicles or buying electric bikes. So it really talks about how the system's going to start to change over time. Yeah, that's right. One of the solutions is for us to build a bigger network and simply put up more poles and wires. The downside of that, though, is that's just going to put the cost up to consumers. And we need to actually manage a lot of these things that are going to happen on our network. When winter comes, people start turning up the energy use in their homes, and that starts to congest the network. So that, for us, is something we want to try and avoid. So we're trying to show people what happens in the peak of the winter, and the price goes up. If you've got storage devices, we can see that putting those and charging those in the middle of the night where the network has capacity is a way of doing that, or if you've got solar or battery, using that to take some of the demand off the network. If you do that, you're going to get a lower power bill. However, the equity of doing that, you've got to make sure that any cost increase is targeted to the people who are putting load on the network rather than the people who aren't putting load on the network. So we've got to get that equity across and make sure the causes are paying their fair share of the demand they're using on the network. If we can lower the peak demand on the network, then largely we can defer our investment. So our investment cost actually happens a lot later. And that demand response is something we need to talk to customers about. So some of the ideas around our demand response that we're working on is to make sure that we can actually send price signals. Charging vehicles at the peak when you get home at 5 o'clock isn't going to help the network. It's going to overload it. Shifting your vehicles to either side of that peak means there's capacity for us to do that without building a bigger network. Or if your vehicle is capable to go and connect into your home, you can use your vehicle to actually take some of the energy from the battery into your home, charge it up later at night. Or solar panels. So these things are going to allow the public to receive payments for some of their behaviours that lowers their demand. And that to us is going to allow us to build a more sustainable network. And hence the TUI on the Fern, and this should now roll out and tell you the web address you can look at to actually get some more information on that. I've got another job as a voiceover person. Fantastic. Who knew? Okay. One of the questions we get quite often is, I can't afford to buy an electric vehicle. And look, we completely understand that. They are very high priced. Despite a lot of our research internationally, the price is meant to be coming down. It is a market, so if you're selling petrol diesel vehicles at the moment, the last thing you're going to do is start to sell a product that's much, much cheaper than that. You can build electric vehicles, we think, in future for around $10,000. They largely have very, very little parts to them. There's about 18, 19 parts compared to the 2,000 parts in a combustion vehicle engine. So these things will start to come down. It's really just trying to get the market to operate. One of the realisations of taking petrol or fossil fuels out of the household and going to electricity, the electricity price goes up. So that's more expensive. But taking out fossil fuels, your overall household energy cost goes down. And that's something we need to get across because people see the barrier of buying a car as a reason to say, oh, I can't buy that, it's too expensive. And the economics will gradually roll through to a point where your petrol or electric vehicles, as the electric vehicles come in, is going to be more difficult to sell into a market that's going to start to electrify. So the message for homeowners is going away from fossil fuels in the home, your energy bill at home is going to get a lot less. And we've seen that in the fuel price. We've seen that sadly with issues around the world with particularly Ukraine and Russia's ability to change what gas is allowed available into the market. So it is changing the price of fuel. So the idea on the left-hand slide is to try and provide incentives or behaviours or awareness for customers taking electric vehicles home, not to charge them at 5 o'clock till 9 o'clock at night when the network is doing its most load in the middle of winter. That'll force us to invest in the network and build a bigger network only for those certain number of hours where it gets congested. So we're looking at chatting with MB, the Commerce Commission, the Electricity Authority, and a number of working groups that we're feeding into to try and look at how smart charging can start to shift vehicles away. So the visibility of vehicles, the interoperability of those vehicles becoming available on the internet is starting to allow us to actually think about that as a service that will be developed. We're trying not to develop the service ourselves. We're trying a market to set that up, because as soon as we develop that ourselves, the market won't establish. So we've got a lot of flexibility of service providers that we're working with. And the right-hand slide is shifting that load outside the peak means that our current net capacity can actually go a lot further and go a lot longer. When we look at the government's initiation of climate change areas for us, it's really looking at where the population goes in Wellington over the next 30 years, what's the uptake of electric vehicles, and what happens when gas no longer is a fuel that's available at homes. We're quite fond of gas hanging around as long as it can. There's a lovely gas network there. 55,000 connections for gas in the Wellington area means it's 55,000 connections we don't have to provide electricity to. It might sound a wee bit odd, but at the moment that's providing a lot of heavy lifting for our network that we don't need to provide through electricity charges. So we are supporting the gas industry to leave their infrastructure in place and find a cleaner form of the gas that's being used. Our London gas networks, our UK gas networks in Leeds and also Wales are both going into hydrogen gas for domestic use. So 2 years ago, we opened up our first 3 full hydrogen homes in Leeds. And every 3 months, the hydrogen appliance providers come in and change the appliances, so each of them have a turn at doing that. Now, the UK has to do that because in the home energy equation, 80% of your energy at home is through gas. In New Zealand, we've got 55,000 connections of gas on our network, but it's the other way around. It's about 80% electric, 20% gas. So we don't really have the gas problem that UK has, which is why our gas industry is looking at a slightly different solution. There is enough biogas to actually operate for every home in New Zealand. So there is a clean gas option that's there. That doesn't meet the government's current thinking about having a zero gas target in 2050. So we just need to work that way through. In the next 2 to 3 months, there will be a gas transition plan that will be shared across the industries to work out where that transition is going to go. So right at the moment, that makes a slightly different or difficult investment path for us to follow. All we can follow at the moment is gas won't be around in 2050. This is just representing those numbers a different way, but you can kind of see that gas does take up quite a large investment for the demand that's coming on the network. So largely our network's going to double its demand, and that's the goal we're looking forward to. So that means we have to increase the capacity of the current assets, which are largely at the end of life. And when we look at a long-term program of investment, we're starting to shift away from a capital program that's running around $32 million and shifting that to a program that starts to run at $72 million. So it's a big change in capital investment. That's largely to actually, you can see it's slightly front-ended, and that's to start to take our larger assets into a capacity that we're going to fill up over 30 years. It's no point us looking at 10 years ahead, because that capacity will be actually taken up, and therefore we've got to reinvest in another asset of a larger size. So front-ending the asset capacity is something we've put in front of the Commerce Commission. We've got a meeting with them in a couple of weeks to talk about why that's a long-term benefit for customers to do that rather than keeping on investing in assets on 10-year cycles. It needs to have a longer focus on that due to the decarbonisation the government has actually signalled in its climate change plans. And the sorts of assets that we need to actually spend the money on, it's largely the large capacity high voltage assets, which is the sub-transmission and zone substations at the start of our supply system from Transpower, and then it sort of filters all the way through to a low voltage network. Our low voltage network, we're hoping with good customer integration and good customer communication can change behaviours around when they use certain large loads like electric vehicle charging and shifting that outside of that peak demand period. A rather busy slide. If you look at the yellow squares, that's currently how we operate our network. Largely, we operate by looking at what a high voltage network does, and the DNO, or distribution network operator function, is largely looking at how we manage a high voltage network. When we start to move forward, and a lot of the fun stuff is happening on the low voltage network, that's where solar's going to inject into the low voltage network, that's where batteries are going to take energy from the network and put energy back into the home or network. And then we've got electric vehicles charging or maybe discharging in the future. That volatility on that network means we have to have a much greater visibility than we've currently got, and therefore we're going to need some new tools and some new models to actually manage how that network operates in real time. So it brings the concept of a distribution system operator, or DSO, into focus, and that's where we need to start to see where smart meters can tell us in roughly about 5 minutes what the demand and load and generation on that low voltage network is doing around those 172,000 connections. Now, we can manage 55 connections in real time with the high voltage network. We don't have a hope in hell of managing 172,000, not without getting a bigger office and several more floors. But we don't need to. If we can understand where people can actually, through energy agreements, make trades of when those services can be shifted, then those agreements can be made and those loads can be shifted through demand-side management. And that's a really important concept of keeping that low voltage network stable. So it is engaging people in the right behaviours. It is actually, through the animation with sound, getting people to understand the idea of the impact they make when they charge their vehicle or when their solar is the most valuable on the network. It's probably not at the time of the day, of the middle of the day. It's probably more valuable in the evening peak, when if they run their solar, which they've probably stored at a very low price, it offsets the larger price of what the network's going to charge by using energy in the peak demand period. So we're here on the left, and we've got quite a bit of investment. Now, we're incredibly lucky that all the green stuff on the right-hand side has come from our sister companies in Australia. So South Australia Power Networks have already got their regulator and their state government to actually agree that they need to go to that. But they were in crisis mode due to too much penetration of solar generation into South Australia. So it was actually driving the network backwards and starting to affect the stability of the transmission system. So they've been allowed to actually put these things in place. And we're a very, very eager fast follower, making sure that we can actually learn from them without having to go through a crisis of too many electric vehicles on the network. And it also means we have to think about how we resource this and how we build our response in our own business of how to do that. The three people joining me, Pamela, Waka and Kevin, have got families. They want to go home at night, so they can't sit there and do the same things. So we've set up our business as pretty much a business as usual model, and we're about to actually bring it into a new business structure where we're going to shift a lot of large projects outside the business to take up the capacity in the market of the bigger jobs we need to get done. And some of these bigger jobs, like building our own substations, which are $20 to $30 million a pop, and there's probably a dozen of those we need to do over the next 12 years, are going through an external model where we can attract larger contracting bases and larger design specialisation to actually do the heavy lifting for us. And the ideas of what these are going to look like in the future, shifting brownfield assets into a larger capacity, is going to be something they would have done somewhere else in New Zealand or Australia. So we're going to leverage the market to do that and start to manage that through. We'll still keep bringing talent into the organisation, like Pema, but at the moment we see that it's going to be too big for us to handle with our current structure. So we're going to go to a structure that's going to use both parts of the market. And that's already working well. One of the contractors who currently isn't working for us, and we use national contractors largely for resilience response, so they can scale and bring people into the area if we do have a large event in Wellington. We're using another contractor who currently isn't working on the network to work on the network to get experience, and that's around our Evans Bay substation upgrade. The challenges we discuss as a distribution company also have wider ramifications around decarbonisation across New Zealand. So we decided we needed to actually go up and down our supply chain to talk to the generators, Transpower and other distributors about how is this going to actually occur? How are these investments going to work? And really feedback to government around what the future looks like when it is electric, and what are the spend profiles, what are the prerequisites that need to be put in place to make this happen. And a lot of this has come out with talking about the scale that transmission and distribution networks need to scale up to, and the accelerated proposals that need to be in place to ensure that the funding is in place in the next 10 years, because if it happens after that, it's too late. The horse is bolted, there isn't capacity, and the load's coming on. So that's going to create a very disruptive future unless we can actually build it very, very soon. There are a lot of transmission projects that are happening. There's a lot of renewable generation projects happening, and we end up getting more value out of the current network if we make a lot of the new connections around electrification smarter. So the idea is an electric vehicle is actually cloud connected, so it can actually work out when it should charge and when it shouldn't charge. We do want to make our distribution transformers, those green boxes that council very, very happily allow us to put on the side of the street. We do need to make those smart. We need to measure those in real time and send a signal to the people in that area, the 200 people, about what the demand response need to be for the next few nights ahead. And that's really going to be a company that will pick up that service from us and start to engage with consumers about where the load can shift to actually ensure the lights stay on. So it's very important, it's very engaging. And what it does is it unlocks a lot of capital that consumers are putting into solar panels and electric vehicles to actually support the network without putting more capital into the network, despite all that being across the fence in private property. So a lot of work to do, but a lot of really rewarding work. And all of those people are actually our shared customers, so what could possibly go wrong? We did a lot of work in our Lifeline projects, and credit to Dame Fran Wild for doing this. She pulled together a lot of the roading, water, electricity, fuel supply, communication, gas and ports to talk about what would happen if we had a big earthquake in Thorndon. 7.5, what it would do to your network, how long would it take to get back together. So it really had a very positive cost-benefit analysis. We used Treasury's merit model, and that allowed us to show that for an investment of around $3 billion, it was a net $6 billion benefit for the Wellington residences. We had 2 electricity projects that we put up as our top 2 must-dos, and that's around our fluid-filled 33 kV sub-transmission cables. They're full of a gas, most of it's nitrogen, most of it's at 200 psi. So it's very inert, but it's a very hard gas to keep in the cables at that pressure when they get a wee bit older. And the second one is the main supply point to Wellington that we're all sharing the lights being on from is Central Park. So Central Park provides 50,000 customers their power supply, including the CBD area all the way out to Miramar, but there's no backup, no alternative. If something goes wrong, it's lights off until it gets fixed. So we've been working since 2009 with Transpower to try and get something better there, and slowly, by step, we're getting closer to Transpower making the right result at some stage in the future. But until then, we've got 50,000 customers at risk, which we are very, very concerned about. Post the Kaikoura 2016 earthquake, there was quite a lot of damage into the Wellington area. We were approached by government to actually do some work on this, and we dusted off something we'd put back to MB 2 years earlier and said, well, this is the plan, was what we would need to do to make Wellington better ready, better prepared for an earthquake response of a larger scale. So we picked about 5 projects. Happy to report today they're all largely done. We reinforced seismically 91 buildings. We've got in 3 data centres away from our central office building. We've put in a digital mobile radio set up, so we've got better comms which are independent from cell phones. We have 2 mobile substations, one in Wellington, which we've got to find a new site for because I'm not allowed to park it at Happy Valley landfill anymore, and one that's sitting in Hutt Valley. Now, these mobile substations, we're about to go up to Hawke's Bay to help with their response to the storms. They elected not to use them in the end. That's really how they're configuring their network at the time. Also have a range of spares so we can build and manage one of our highest vulnerabilities. That's the 33 kV gas-filled cables, and we'll pop up and go above ground with an overhead line build structure. We've got large steel frames which blocks will go on, and poles go in and will string down the streets that Wellington City Council allows to go down to bring power onto those communities. and use the mobile substations to sort that out. So we've targeted the buildings that are the most critical buildings in Wellington, reinforced those to IL4 63%, and we've largely finished most of those buildings. And that's because the funding we got from the Commerce Commission, we made our application to go to a different price bar for $32 million, had to be finished by 2021, and it was. So that was great. The work we're doing now is on Newtown. So Newtown substation has got a brick facade. It's got we had a triple brick building around it. It's a heritage building, and it had a roof that has largely all been replaced. So we've spent a few $1 million on this, and we're just moving into what we do with the facade. So there's some wear and tear, a bit of patina on there. We just like to get finished. Finish the fencing, because that's just temporary construction. Most of the equipment inside there was for trolley buses, so it's come out. And we've been able to actually use this building to house one of our data centres, and also an emergency response centre should staff. On the studies we did in the 2019 Lifelines project, Wellington breaks into about 6 islands. So this is one of the islands and one of the centres we can actually manage the network from. So hopefully we can invite the councillors to that once we've finished the frontage, and maybe enjoy a glass of champagne, because all the electrical assets are outside. So these are our two major projects for Lifelines. One is Central Park, and seeking Transpower's help to actually upgrade that substation to an area that gives us much more supply diversity, and I think they're now down the land acquisition path. And on the left is what it looks like to spend $150,000 on a cable joint, which is under a road. And it's just a ridiculous amount of money for an asset that is really up for replacement. And one of the really good things about decarbonisation is these cables don't have capacity, so they'll be replaced, which is a wonderful outcome. So I just was asked to put in a couple of slides of what's going well with Wellington City Council and what are the opportunities. Going well for us, and it's not that well tested, which is a fantastic result, is the coordination with welfare services during major events. We allow council to do all of that for us. We just get on with fixing the network, and we really appreciate that. We think that's a wonderful thing to do. And it really starts to tap into your communication systems and your engagement with your communities. And we think that works really, really effectively. It certainly did in the 2013 storms we had here. Cooperation with major roading disruption for CBD works. We've done some big works in getting power from Central Park to Frederick Street along some pretty major routes, and that's gone pretty smoothly with good engagement with the council, so very, very happy for the support we received there. Regulatory changes, changing our price path to invest in greater earthquake readiness. The Commission did ask us to talk publicly. If we'd put that in the public would have said no, because they'd rather not spend $32 million. But we use councils through the mayoral forum as the voice of the community, and the council were very happy with that result because of the benefit that had. Greater Wellington and support from Wellington City on the move to electric buses we think is an absolute brilliant strategy going forward, so congratulations on that decision. And obviously need to work with Wellington City on what their energy transition is going to be as they decarbonise through electrification. So we're really sort of talking about what's happening with pools, what's happening with some of those areas, and what impact that's going to make on our network. What are the opportunities? Well, the thermal transition planning is something. We've got 100 megawatts of thermal load in Wellington, run on gas and other things, coal, that we need to find a home for electricity. So there's about 60 megawatts of electricity that needs to come on our network to decarbonise Wellington. So we're starting to work on that with a consultant called DETA. They've done a lot of work up and down the country, and it starts to have a conversation with those customers using thermal heating as to where they're going to go with actually going to electricity, and that helps with their planning as to what their timing will be. We think there's an opportunity to talk to Wellington City in a wee bit more detail about road acting notices for minor works. We seem to be doing a lot of sort of hand-to-mouth stuff, which really could be done much more efficiently. We've been working on this network for 15 years, but we're having to apply as if it's the first time we've ever done a job in Wellington. So there's probably a way or a dispensation we can do to actually streamline some of this work going forward. Lifelines project completion. We'd really like Wellington City Council support for getting Central Park finished from Transpower. As much pressure as you can put on them to get this finished earlier, the better night's sleep I will get for Wellington. And public education of behaviour around demand-side management. This is something, if it's a common message around how people should operate to make sure the price of electricity doesn't need to go higher than it needs to go, is something we think should be across all of our community and community agencies. So we'd endorse the council, having an engagement program with us about getting some of that messaging out to customers as well, because it is around a cheaper price of energy in the home. We've partnered with a project called Energy Mate, where our retailers and us as the Lions Company are putting in people to go into homes to talk about, in the low socioeconomic areas, what they can do better to save money on the electricity account. And that's working really, really well. It's looking at how people are heating, access they have to other services around thermal drapes, and also making the homes less drafty, less damp, and warmer ways of doing that. And that's been really, really good for the health of our community. Infrastructure co-location opportunities. We think that our network is going to have some support very, very quickly, and we're looking at options of putting battery support into transformers on the street. So it's another box. We did joke about borrowing some buses, which are 200 kilowatts of storage, and using those to actually keep communities going, which are starting to overload. So there will be a dispensation we'll be seeking from council to put some more kit or more infrastructure to keep the lights on while we actually increase the capacity of those networks as they start to run through. And again, it's the visibility of where they're going to be. We only have to do it 4,000 times, but hopefully by that stage, we're going to do it over a period of 30 years.
Hey, Greg, are we almost at the end just because we've got about 10 minutes left for questions?
No problem. And the last one is let's get Wellington moving. We're really keen to sort of have that move forward on a no surprises basis. At the moment, we're sort of being engaged with pitches about what things will look like, but there's no real meaningful discussion on what infrastructure projects are going to do. So those are some of the things we're there. I'm pretty happy to leave that there and take some questions, because I think all I've got now is conclusions.
Cool. Okay. All right. So we've got Councillor Young, then me, then Councillor Free, then Councillor Chung.
Greg, thank you. So I've got a couple of questions. First of all, you said 64% of the lines, or whatever the term is, are underground. What is happening with areas, the older suburbs in Wellington, like Newtown, Thorndon, Mount Victoria, where they have overhead cables? Is anything being done to underground those?
No, we think staying overhead is the best result in suburbs that find it very hard to get a service to an underground connection. So spanning those very steep driveways or
No driveways.
Or spanning those very steep sections is easier through an aerial cable.
Okay,
Absolutely.
It's just they're incredibly unsightly. So the next thing is, thinking of the fact they're on power poles, I remember Jeff Kennedy, who owns Prefab, was complaining about the fact that we have timber power poles in Wellington, which are more suited to Ekatahuna, wherever that is. Is there any move to get rid of those timber power poles? Because they do look very rural.
Yeah, they do have a certain...
You have a short answer to that one, eh?
Yeah, they do look real.
Lots of questions.
Yeah, so we are replacing with concrete poles largely because easier to maintain. They don't rot underground, so they're moving to concrete.
Okay, and one last question is, what about all the areas where there's no ability to charge EVs because there's no off-street parking, like most of the suburbs I just mentioned before?
Yeah, that's a question that we're starting to think about, people charging not at home. So that really comes back into a public charging idea, that if you're, and I suppose if I take this right to the outcome I'll be hoping for, is parking your car in a car park building plugged in and using solar from someone else's home, which is gifted into your vehicle because it's now got an identifier, is where the future is. So I think there's a whole lot of new thinking that can happen around. We'd love them to charge at home because therefore we can actually manage the network, but there will be completely the opposite. They may be charging while they're parked, while they're actually working.
Okay, so we've got quite a big list of questions, so let's keep it to one question each, and then we can maybe catch up with Greg after this. People have got stuff to do at 10:30, so we're going to stick to one question each. Okay, my question is, there's quite a focus on what customers can do to reduce their energy use, but I'm reading in this report from the Electricity Price Review that residential electricity prices have increased by 79% while commercial rates have dropped by 24%. And I also see that some of these gentailers are making huge billions and billions of dollars in profit. So why does the onus fall back on the families and the residential users?
Yeah, so just recently the transmission pricing methodology shifted the balance between transmission pricing away from residential and onto commercial. So residential customers will see their price stay flat for a wee bit longer. The idea of moving to time of use pricing means that the time of use when the energy is occurring will change the price by hour. And the ability behind that is it gives people the ability to actually think about managing their price in a different way. Retailers are making lots of money, and that's a market issue that the Electricity Authority are trying to deal with, and it comes down to shortages. So if you've got no hydro, no water in the lakes supplying hydropower, the price will go up. You've got uncertainty around gas, and gas is used for the backup generation for the thermal sets when the hydro is low, the price goes up. We've been in that position for the last 3 years, and that's why the household price of energy has gone up, and that's why the market is very, very high at the moment. Luckily right now, the hydro lakes are full, sometimes overflowing, and the gas market is trying to bring their gas price back down because a lot of it was Porakura was offline, one of the large gas providers into the gas system. So that instability is there. I could slightly tongue-in-cheek say that 3/4 of those energy retailers are actually owned 51% by government. So there is a bit of money flowing back into government, which really where that decision sits as to how much profit they should be making.
Thank you. Councillor Free.
Yeah, try and keep them concise.
One question.
Okay, so my most important question is we're getting a new sludge treatment plant near the airport, and also Greater Wellington are going to have a charging depot in Kilburnie. Have those things been factored into your thinking about the supply required?
Yes, they have. They're certainly in our 30-year plan. We're taking a slightly bigger look at Miramar because there's so many loads going on all at once. And if we do them individually, it's going to be not as efficient if we step back and did them all at once and actually built the right size cable once rather than try it 5 times. So we're looking at having a meeting with all of those parties in the Miramar Peninsula area to say, what is it that you're doing to make sure we get the best, latest update, and then say, this is our plan and this is the shared cost and investment we actually need to do. We're doing a lot of work. Kevin's doing some work now for Weta, and we have to finish that by Christmas time, which is to the detriment of having a very successful Avatar 2, and you could see in the discussions in the front page of the Dominion Post or the Post how they really push the network to the limit. The technology they're using is just off the chart, but it is very energy intensive. So we're running increased infrastructure to them before Christmas, but it's twice as big as it needs to be because we know beyond that we've got Moa Point, we've got the thermal centre at the airport, we've got Kilburnie bus charging. Bus charging is a wonderful thing to think about as a council. Why would you put all of your eggs in one basket at one depot? Why don't you distribute the buses around?
That's the regional council building.
Sorry, regional council. Yep.
Yeah.
But we smile at sometimes the thinking of how they were as a diesel unit. They'll be better spread around and actually charging overnight at rail stations where the rail infrastructure is not used during the night, and there's tons
That's
of
a conversation for the regional
It
council,
is.
but we'll pass that on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Chung.
I was up in, thanks very much for your presentation. I was up in Japan last year and I looked at how they were, had a trial run where they put transducers into the ground so electric cars can actually charge while they're driving. Now, they're quite well advanced with this, and they're also doing this in China now. So are there any plans to actually do this in New Zealand?
We don't have the population to actually spend that level of infrastructure investment. A team called Drayson Racing did the same around a racetrack. They took the batteries out of the race cars and just used motors and an induction loop on the track. So inductive charging goes back to Councillor Young's question, is probably how we're going to charge cars that don't have garages, is build induction plates in the street. But that's really a question that council have to sort of help us get through and work that through. So we don't have the population to support that investment.
Councillor Pennant.
Thank you very much, and apologies for being late. Can I just ask why your planning time frame is so short? It's better than 10, 30 is better than 10, but why not 100 or 200?
Are you talking about planning timeline being right out? Yeah, it's a great question. One I probably won't hear the answer to in my lifetime. It's 30 years is challenging for looking at what technology is going to be available and getting it somewhere close to where it's going to actually be value to customers. If we go further than that, I think we won't know with climate change as to what we are having to actually build the network for, and therefore what that's going to be left as to where things will actually migrate to. We tend to build towards centres of load or centres of developing load, and that's where we sort of build the assets. The building blocks, probably similar to council, are sort of around that 45 to 55 year age. So that's kind of where our horizon for planning stops.
Councillor Carver, I'll bump you up the list since you've got to go at 10:30.
Thank you. And I'm not going to ask about the transformer for Kandala Pool, but anyway. But what I'm really interested to know is probably more from our officers. How do we, what's our plans in coordinating more with Wellington Electricity? Because there's obviously a lot of things that we could be working in partnership with, or probably are. But actually, where do we take this forward, or how? What's the thinking of officers?
I think that there is opportunity for us to collaborate more, particularly with the asset management planning and the long-term asset management planning. And I think that if Wellington Electricity are looking at timeframes of around 30 years with regards to their planning horizon, we've got an infrastructure and finance strategy that reaches out the similar sort of timeframe. And so I think that there is opportunities there for collaboration. At the moment, there is collaboration that occurs with Wellington Electricity and Council, but there is an opportunity there for probably a more extended timeframe and looking at things out further. Yeah, sure.
Councillor Brown.
When, as I understand it, New Zealand Bus is looking to put a depot in Burnham Wharf, and clearly they're going to want a lot of capacity there to recharge the buses, which I presume over quite a short space of time are going to become fully electric. That's going to require quite a significant investment in infrastructure to deliver the electricity to them. You've put a good case that they should be more flexible and all the rest of it, but that's not the way they're thinking. Who's going to pay for that? Are you going to charge New Zealand Bus the entire cost of your marginal investment in capacity, or are you going to actually allocate some of that additional cost across other users of the network?
Yes. Now, to be very clear on that, because of the other demand in that area, it sort of comes back to the wetter example we used, is knowing all those loads in the graph we had earlier of the picture of Wellington with all the transport loads coming in. We want to design a network where we try and trench as little as we need to with the size of capacity of cable that can go to the customer for their needs. They might use 20% of it, and the other 80% shared amongst the other customers that will be using it further down the track. So we will be building ahead of time, which is the graph we're sort of discussing with the Commission in a couple of weeks, rather than actually waiting and treating each load as a separate load and each cable being separately trenched. So we want to build a larger capacity up front and allocating that across the people that are actually taking that demand over the next 4 to 5 years.
So, in other words, the householders won't pay?
There will be some that goes back into our asset base, but it's probably only the top 20%. We're there for the cables because they last, or in some cases, 70 years. We still need capacity headroom. We need to provide for how that load is going to grow. And that'll be people around, if we choose, Burnham Wharf, people around the Miramar area putting electric vehicles onto the network at some stage in the future.
Cool. Okay, so it's now 10:30. So quick questions from Deputy Mayor, then Councillor McNulty, Councillor Abdurrahman, and then Councillor Randall, and then that's it. So,
Kia ora. Thank you so much for the presentation. Just your comment, or the comments about energy efficiency for homes. Is there any data on how we can measure homes that are not energy efficient yet? Because we've got some thinking that perhaps a lot of homes have been upgraded, and so I guess, do you have any data, and will the smart meters help us to understand where and pinpoint where we can get better efficiency for individual homes?
Yeah, it's really why we've joined and helped co-fund the Energy Mate program, is to go into the low decile area and look at a healthy homes program of making sure they're less drafty and everything else. So the government doing their Warm Up New Zealand or Healthy Homes program around insulation has to continue, and that's showing where that's going. Smart meters will only cover off the electrical demand. It doesn't cover off if they're burning coal or using other the sources of warmth in their homes. If you go right down to the full analysis of what a home is doing, you start using thermal cameras to look at how the windows are performing with heat going out of the home. So from a smart meter, you can tell from the different areas how the consumption is being used and give you clues around behaviour at certain times, which you might want to ask, can we find out why that's occurring and what you're using for doing that? Some of the people we've been to see are using their oven to heat their home because that's the only source of electrical heating because they can't afford anything else.
Councillor McNulty.
Hey Greg, great presentation. We've had a big project up in Tawa for installing new LED streetlights, and I understand there's the process of livening, and that can take a long time. So we've had lights that get installed, and it can be 6 months before they're actually powered on. I'm just wondering if you might be able to explain why livening takes so long, or shed a little bit of light, pun not intended, on what that process entails.
Look, that's a great pun. I'd have to look into that and find out why it would take that long to liven. Normally, once things are built, the idea of getting them onto the system benefits us because then we've got a line charge revenue coming in. So it wouldn't be helping our interests to leave them for 6 months.
Cool, I'll drop you an email. Thank you.
Thank you.
And finally, Councillor Randall.
Yes, you can see why you need to support much greater investment. A very simple question, really, because I don't know how much the price to the household is really covered for capital and asset replacement versus actual paying for the power. What sort of percentage increase would a household expect as you move from an investment of $32 million a year per year capital to $72 million? Are we talking like a 1%, 5, 10%? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, so roughly the customer's bill is made up around 25 to 30% of line charges. So that's that component. So it's not a major component. If you're starting to shift the price of the network into recovery from customers, then it really comes down to making sure there's the equity of the people who are causing the highest demand. At the time when the network's congested, will pay a higher price. So that's shifting to time of use pricing. So you are capturing customers there. So the bill component of that will really change depending on how customers are going to behave, and ones who can shift their demand away from that high peak period. Ones that don't shift it away, then their variable price is going to actually cause an increase in line charge to support the network. So it goes back to my earlier slide about the household electricity price will increase. That's probably going to increase around 25 to 30% on the investment we need to make. But that's presupposing that people will shift their behaviour away, or the ones that aren't heavily into using electricity in the peak demand period will actually benefit from paying less of that share.
Okay, so just to be clear, you're talking about 25 to 30% more on the line charges?
Correct.
Not on the total price?
Correct.
Okay, so it's about 25% line charges that might go up by 25% if people don't adjust to demand management and follow some smart metering and that sort of stuff?
Correct.
Thank you very much.
Great.
It's very interesting.
Greg, thank you so much for joining us this morning and your team. Feel free to stick around, grab a hot drink at the back, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and discussion for you as well. Thank you.
Good, thank you.
Thanks.